Hello and welcome back to the Determinants of Health. In this lecture, we're going to start the process of talking about gender, one of the most important of the determinants of health, for reasons that I think are fairly obvious, but we'll go through them anyway. And with this video, you'll see that we're trying something new. You'll see my face at the bottom of your screen, which is a new addition. Hopefully it's not too distracting. Just want to make sure you know that a real person is actually talking to you. It's not a computerized voice emanating from the ether. So let's begin by talking about something called the maternal mortality rate, also called the obstetric death rate. And some purists might be angry with me for starting a talk about gender by talking about maternity, because it tends to define women's health in terms of their function as a mother, which is quite limiting and in some ways objectifying and offensive. But there's a reason I want to start with the MMR. MMR is one of our most important indicators of population health. We use it to describe the ability of a country, a government, a state, a community, a population to protect its most vulnerable, the children being the most vulnerable. And you start out as a child, as a fetus inside your mother's womb. And so the extent to which a society is able to protect its pregnant women is the extent to which its health system is robust. So we like to have a low MMR. So it's defined as the number of female deaths per 100,000 live births in that particular community or country. And the deaths that we're measuring are any death that is related to or aggravated by the pregnancy itself, or its management, and we're not counting accidents. So globally, about 830 women die every single day from something related to childbearing. That's a very high number. And we think that the high number of such deaths is related to the inequalities in accessing healthcare services. In fact, one of the biggest predictors of whether or not you're going to have a successful live birth is the extent to which you receive prenatal care. And if you're part of a society or a culture or a country where prenatal care is not available or access to it is limited, chances are that population is going to have a high MMR. What kinds of people have high MMRs? Poor people have high MMRs. So this in many ways is a proxy measurement of the gap between rich and poor. It's important to note that pretty much all maternal deaths happen in poor countries. I say pretty much because there's still a few that happen in wealthy countries, and we're going to talk about that in a second because there's something interesting and horrifying about that. Now, the majority of these deaths, as mentioned, have to do with being poor, have to do with not having access to key prenatal services. And more than half of these 99% of all deaths around the world occurring around pregnancy, more than half of them occur in just a handful of areas, typically sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So they're happening to people in the most vulnerable of states, places where countries have been ravaged by HIV/AIDS, by war, by poverty, by climate change, that sort of thing. And the risk is highest for young women, in fact girls under 15, because pregnancy complications tend to cluster in that age range. So why do women die during pregnancy? Well, the biggest reason is bleeding during or after childbirth. And this is tragic for a number of reasons, one of which is it's very preventable or treatable with a handful of drugs or techniques or therapies. And this is why it's important for pregnant women to get prenatal care, but also postnatal care, and to give birth with a certified birth attendant or a trained individual who knows how to stop bleeding if it arises. Infections are also a very common cause of death for these women. This is why it's important to have hygiene and, again, trained birth attendants. And we have these other medical conditions like high blood pressure and complications arising from delivery. Also, we would count in this statistic unsafe abortion, which is why it's important for women globally to have access to safe, legal, hygienic abortion services from well-trained practitioners, because the alternative is that they will seek these services from individuals with poor training in conditions that are less than ideal, leading to horrendous complications and very often death. And the remainder of these maternal deaths are associated with the diseases that make the news: malaria, AIDS, and so forth. Now this graph shows us something very interesting. This is MMR rates in the USA from 1998 to 2005. The orange line is Black Americans, and the other lines are all races, white and other. Now, the latter three are very similar to each other, and the black population clearly is distinguished in having a noticeably higher MMR across all years in the USA. That tells us a few things right up front. There is an interaction here between, well, gender, because it's only women who experienced MMR, race, and probably measurements of SES, of socioeconomic status. Even though Black women have the worst experiences with MMR in the USA, the rate of around 30 to 38 is actually not that high on the global landscape, because globally the rate is 216. And by the way, that's down profoundly over the past few years, because globally we've made important strides towards lowering MMR and lowering infant mortality as well. But still, 30 is 30 too high. 38 is 38 too high. Many theorists believe that the American and Canadian MMR estimates are underestimates. We're not capturing a very important experience that pregnant women in North America have that relates to their mortality. And this will horrify you. But there is some evidence that, in fact, the leading cause of death among pregnant women in North America is, in fact, homicide. They're being killed. They're being killed by their partners, their boyfriends, their husbands, and so forth. We don't capture that information because that's not considered to be a pregnancy-related death. Maybe it should be, because something about their state of being pregnant is triggering something in their partners that is causing them to be murderous. So some advocates think that we should be capturing homicide rates as our MMR, and that would raise the Canadian and American rates substantially. Now this is an important statistic, and I took you on a long path to get here, because it really, for me, underlines the importance of looking at gender as a determinant of health. It's women only that are bearing the brunt of the risk of homicide when it comes to pregnancy. It's not the men who are being murdered by the pregnant women, at least not in any appreciable sense. So this is a clear example of the divide between the genders or sexes where it comes to a particular health experience. So, sex and or gender is an important determinant of health. Why? Because there are some obvious biological differences that affect how one group responds to certain physical challenges versus the other. And these physical challenges can include infection, it can include responses to medication, it can include how we present our various symptoms and illnesses. Now, are there profound biological differences between men and women? Absolutely there are. In fact, I'm fond of telling people all the time that I, as a man, have more in common genetically with a male chimpanzee than I do with any female human. That's because the differences between the X and Y chromosome are more profound than the genetic differences between humans and chimpanzees. It's a good cocktail party fact. Impress your friends. Use it. As well, gender differences can determine how society deals with us. So, do I have access to education differently than if I were female? Do I have access to health care differently? Am I more easily or less easily employed? Am I more likely to get certain jobs than other jobs? Is my doctor more likely to take my complaints more seriously? All these things are possible depending upon your perspective. Notice that I've used the words sex and gender here. So we're going to talk about that now. Sex and gender are different constructs, and as good scientists, we should take care not to conflate them. So according to WHO, sex refers to the biological, physiological, physical characteristics that differentiate men from women. Put aside intersex issues, third sex issues that are real, but do not happen at a large enough prevalence to enter into this conversation yet. So sex is the measurable, describable, physical, biological differences between men and women. Gender, on the other hand, refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expectations, attitudes. It's unclear the extent to which these behaviors, attitudes, and preferences are biologically driven and how much they are constructed for us. For example, we like to think of boys as wearing blue and girls as wearing pink. But that's not biological, or is it? Some people claim that it is, that boys have a preference for the color blue and girls have a preference for the color pink. As a side note, historically, it was actually flipped. A couple hundred years ago in British society, it was the boys who were dressed as pink and the girls who were dressed as blue. So clearly that is a constructed framework. It's not something that is innately biological as a physical preference. So sex is a term that we use to describe biology, and gender is a term that is imposed upon us or something that is culturally or socially defined. Man is sex, male is gender, woman is sex, female is gender. It's possible to be a masculine woman. It's possible to be a feminine man. Masculine and feminine are gender terms. Man and woman are sex terms. So, depending upon your sex or gender, your mortality will differ as well. So biologically, men have shorter lifespans than women. This is apparently universal across all cultures, all time periods, and so forth. Now, I say men, I mean the sex, men. There's something biologically distinct about men, about the Y chromosome, that makes us die earlier. Now, women live longer, except that women as a gender, the female gender, in societies where that gender has fewer opportunities, less access to jobs, less access to healthcare services, less access to information, less able to define their way through life, their mortality rates drop down to approach those of men. In other words, the effects of gender, the negative effects of gender in this case, actually serve to dilute the effects of sex. So men have higher mortality rates across all groups, but they also have more opportunity. So do those two things balance each other out? In some cultures, they actually start to. So, in very poor countries, extremely high birth rates and a variety of inequalities actually disadvantage women more, and as a result, their life expectancies come down to meet those of men. And again, those disadvantages that the women experience are gender disadvantages. They're not sex disadvantages. You see the distinction? The gender is how society responds to them. Sex is who they are innately and biologically. Now, I want to make a note about women's health versus what we're talking about now, which is gender and health. So women's health is what we talk about when we're dealing specifically with the health needs of women. The reproductive needs and so forth, things that are specific to their anatomy and physiology. But gender and health is a discussion of both men and women and how we interact with the healthcare system and with health in general. The literature on gender and health is, however, disproportionately focused on women for a variety of reasons, largely because they are traditionally underserviced and so there's ripe opportunity to be studied. But because the literature is heavy on the women's component, this gives the impression that when we talk about gender and health, we're actually just talking about women, but we're not. We're talking about men as well. So how does sex and or gender, how do those things actually affect health? How do they result in either greater or lesser health, depending on how you want to define health? First, there's something about powerlessness. If your gender in the society in which you live actually causes you to be somewhat more powerless, either through lack of voting rights or lack of access to a doctor, or the fact you have to speak to somebody else before you can see a doctor directly, or the fact that you can't get a job or not allowed to have a job, so you haven't got money, so you can't buy medicines. All these things are about powerlessness. That's going to affect your health, obviously. It also affects how you're going to be exposed to certain diseases. So think about if you're in a society, if you're a woman in a society where you are not empowered to negotiate safe sex. If it's expected that when you have sex with your husband or your partner, it must be unprotected because that's what he wants. You can't demand a condom. Suddenly, you are at risk for contracting a host of horrible diseases, especially HIV/AIDS. Now, that's a gender issue. Powerlessness is gender. On the other hand, women are more likely than men to recover their language ability after suffering a left hemisphere stroke. Is that sex or gender? I suspect that's more of a sex issue because it sounds like a biological construct. It might not be. All this stuff might in fact be constructed and socially determined. If you look at Australia as a case study, in Australia, the leading risk factors for heart disease for the women are in fact obesity and overweight, but for the men it's tobacco smoking. So the same disease outcome has different pathways depending upon if you're a man or a woman in Australia. Is that a sex or a gender thing? It could be both. There could be some susceptibility at the genetic level, but there's some behavior issues going on at the gender level. If you have unprotected sex, women are 2 times more likely than men to get an STI, and 10 times more likely to get HIV. Is that sex or gender? Well, that sounds like straight up biology to me. That's a sex difference. And it's a pretty profound sex difference that makes women far more invested in the HIV situation than men would be for that reason alone. As well, women who smoke are profoundly more likely to get lung cancer than do men who smoke, even at the same dosage. We also have some biases in research that maybe you haven't even thought about. So historically we've treated women as just another kind of man. What does that mean? It means that when we're doing clinical trials, we'll perform them only on men, and we'll assume that the women will behave exactly the same way. And so we prescribe the drugs afterwards to the women in the same doses. Why would we do that? Why would we only do the tests on just men? Well, there are a host of historical reasons. One of them is we're concerned that if the women are pregnant, we're exposing the children, or the babies rather, to the drug. Is that a rational concern? Maybe, maybe not. It might be a legal concern. I would ask you to listen to the Freakonomics podcast episode called Bad Medicine Part 2, Drug Trials and Tribulations. The link is right here on the slide. The first 18 minutes talks about historical biases, gender and sex biases in clinical drug trials. It's eye-opening. Now I want to talk a little bit about this thing called intersectionality. Intersectionality is a social sciences term, and it's been around for about a decade or so, and essentially it's defined this way: the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. What does that mean? It means you can't just look at one of these factors when trying to analyze an inequality. It can't just be about class differences. It can't just be about race. It can't just be about gender. It can't just be about culture. It can't just be about nationality, etc., etc., etc. What does that sound like? It sounds a lot like the Determinants of Health, doesn't it? So these concepts are talking about the same thing, but in gender studies they like to use the word intersectionality. So essentially it's the belief that oppression is interlinked with a variety of factors. Therefore, if we're going to address oppression or inequality or disparity, we can't just target one thing. So, let's look at Aboriginal status as an example of intersectionality. In Canada, Aboriginal women have a rate of diabetes 5 times higher than it is for all other women in Canada. Aboriginal men, the rate is 3 times higher. So what does that mean? It means that Aboriginals have worse diabetes than non-Aboriginals, but the women have it worse than the men. So what's the story here? Is it the Aboriginal status or is it the gender? It's both. They're intersecting. They're interrelated. They're interconnected. Okay, let's look at socioeconomic status. So worldwide, men are more literate than women. This is clearly a gender issue and not a sex issue, because we know women and men can both learn to read at quite profound levels. So there's something about society that is gating access to literacy and disadvantaging women. But in wealthier countries, girls actually have better literacy skills than boys in schools. They're more confident about getting high-paying jobs as a result, because literacy actually is thought of by education experts as being the best path to professional success. It's not math skills, it's literacy skills. And as an employer, as an educator, let me confirm that for you. Absolutely true. The hardest thing to find is a good communicator, a good writer. It's easier to find good math skills. So in the USA, girls are ahead of boys, excuse me, in writing ability at all levels of education. The boys are better in math. Education is power. What does that mean? It means that education opens the door to income, to employment, to political power, and so forth. If you do not have access to education, you don't have access to a host of other opportunities, including navigating systems. What kind of systems? Healthcare systems. It's not sufficient to say, hey, you can go see a doctor. Do you know what to ask that doctor? Do you know what symptoms to tell that doctor? Are you afraid of the doctor? Education gives you that ability. There's also an advantage when it comes to educating women as opposed to men, because women are the gateway to the rest of the family. Again, this is a little offensive to some people because it's characterizing women as being valuable only in as much as their role as mothers is concerned. That's not the case here. What we're saying is there's a double advantage to educating women. Not only do you get to educate her, but her knowledge trickles down to her children. So one of the biggest predictors of children's nutritional knowledge, how to eat well, how to feed themselves, is the mother's knowledge. In fact, the biggest predictor of anyone's IQ is their mother's IQ. Investment in female intellect pays dividends throughout the entire family. Now, globally, 3/4 of men of a working age are actually at work. Only half of women are at work. So women are more unemployed than men. However, this statistic is a bit misleading because it does not consider what we call informal work. Is the work that a woman does at home for the family, is that considered to be work? In this analysis, it is not. But in many cultures and countries, the work done at home is actually quite complicated and quite in-depth and quite needed. It supports that country's economy. If the women did not do this work at home, maintaining the domestic economy, then the formal economy could not function. So maybe we need to redefine these statistics to include the roles that people who stay at home and do these tasks actually perform. This is Canadian labor force participation data from 1953 to about the present, and you'll notice that the women who are in red at first were quite underemployed, and then in the modern era have really closed that gap fast. However, the difference between men and women is maintained. It's still noticeable and significant. It looks to be about a 10% gap. So women are about 10% less likely to be employed than are men, even in Canada. There are several ways of measuring gender gaps around the world. There's something called the Global Gender Gap Index, which I'll talk about for a second. It's computed by the World Economic Forum, and we compute it, or they compute it rather, for a country, not for an individual or an organization, but for given countries. The index ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 would be disastrous, incredibly high inequality, and 1 would be perfect equality between the sexes. And they compute it using a variety of observations, including observations having to do with the extent to which both genders are participating in the economy, the extent to which they have opportunities to participate, how much they become educated and have opportunities to be educated, how politically empowered they are. And that includes things like, do they have the voting right? Are they in parliament? And has there been a female leader for X number of years? And lastly, of course, things like life expectancy and how healthy they are, depending upon a variety of measurements. So let's look at the global gender gap. This map shows us places where there is less and more gender equality according to this index. The more red, the more inequality. The more green, the more equality. Not surprisingly, the most unequal places tend to be in Africa and the Middle East. The most equal places appear to be Iceland, Western Europe. This chart shows us what's called an ecological analysis, attempting to show a relationship between what we just computed, the global gender index score, and something called the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index looks at a variety of constructs, including health, including economic wealth, and it's a way of ranking a country on its development, including its wealth and happiness and things like that. It's not perfect, but what we're looking for here in this chart is something resembling a linear relationship, and it looks like there might be a hand-waving straight line here, right? What that tells us then is that the more gender equality there is, the more development there is. Iceland is the most developed, one of the most developed, and certainly the most gender equal. Chad is both poorly developed and also very unequal. So there's an argument to be made here that there's a relationship between achieving gender equality and having a highly developed society. Similarly, this graph shows us the relationship between gender equality and global competitiveness. So competitiveness has to do with economic activity, and it measures things like, is there a market for selling goods, are there international relationships, etc., etc., etc. And again, we have something resembling a straight line going from the lower left to the upper right. And this tells the hand-waving, imprecise story that with more gender equality, we have more economic activity. Again, Chad at the bottom, very poor economic activity, very poor equality, whereas the Scandinavian countries have very high gender equality and very high global competitiveness. So how do we help achieve gender equality, especially when it comes to science and health? Well, we have this thing called gender mainstreaming, which is a process by which we try to prioritize gender equality in our formal structures, especially through government. So we try to incorporate gender analysis or gender perspective into aspects of politics and decision making. What we're trying to do is to shift what we call our institutional culture. That's how institutions, schools, governments, employers think about gender. So the objective is to create optimum outcomes for everybody. The assumption is that there have been historical factors that have disadvantaged one gender over another, and not always in the same direction. I mean, men are disadvantaged in some ways. Men are more likely to die at work, for example. That's not a good thing. We don't want to have women die at work. We want to have fewer men die at work. So these historical disadvantages, we attempt to compensate for them by creating a level playing field through this process called gender mainstreaming. Here's an example. There's a British game show called Taskmaster. Doesn't matter what the show's about. It's a silly little task show. And in season 2, these 5 competitors were competing. and their task was to go up on stage and to eat a banana and to tie a necktie in a certain amount of time. And this woman, the only woman on the panel, Catherine Ryan, complained that it was a misogynistic task because she didn't know how to tie a necktie because she's a woman. She doesn't wear neckties. Now, the task was developed by men who didn't even think about the fact that women would not know how to tie a necktie. Now, obviously, some women know how to tie neckties. Some men don't know how to tie neckties. This isn't a universal statement, but she was right in that a woman is more likely not to know how to tie a necktie more so than a man is. That's an example of an institutional bias against women when it comes to a task. And it was unconscious. No one meant to disadvantage her, but she pointed out, and it was accommodated. So similarly, with gender mainstreaming, we attempt to accommodate situations that have unconscious biases against one gender over the other. So things that we ask when going through a gender mainstreaming process is, maybe we're doing a scientific study, and we're only doing it on men rather than women. Why? Can we justify why a given gender was left out? Is the outcome we're looking at relevant for all genders or just one? And if so, can we justify that? Usually we can. Let's say we're looking at diminishing menstrual pain. Well, that's clearly only relevant to women, and it makes sense because only women have menstrual pain. Are the interventions possible gender interactions warranted or known? What does that mean? Well, maybe the drug you are giving causes one gender to have migraines over the other. We don't know that it does. Have we even thought about that question? So the process simply asks us to ask ourselves the question: do assessment tools bias one gender over the other? So perhaps on an exam, I would give you an exam in class, and it's talking about experiences that one gender has and the other one doesn't. Is that fair? Probably not. Are there barriers to access that will affect one gender over the other? Okay, so maybe it's harder for one group of people to see the doctor than the other. In some very conservative societies, a woman is only allowed to speak to other women. So if the doctor is male, well, what's she supposed to do? She's supposed to describe her symptoms to her husband, who then explains it to the doctor. That actually happens. So in that scenario, she's lost privacy and she's lost the accuracy of her medical complaint. All I'm trying to say is that when we talk about gender and health, this is an amazingly complicated story, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. So let's leave it there, and I will wave goodbye. Bye.